Great. So we'll get started now with our first presentation from Peter Massini. Peter is a director at Future Nature Consulting, and Peter is an experienced green infrastructure strategist, policymaker, and practitioner, following a 30-year career working for environmental NGOs, government agencies, and as the Green Infrastructure Policy Lead at the Greater London Authority. Peter established his own practice, Future Nature Consulting, in 2021. He advises both public and private sector clients on the policy and practice of green infrastructure, nature-based solutions, urban greening, and biodiversity conservation in the urban environment. So over to you, Peter.
Okay, thanks, Ali. I was going to share my screen. Just reminds me, I ought to shorten my bio, I think.
I actually shortened it. That was the shortened version.
Yeah, can everyone see my screen? I'll just put it onto on presentation mode. Can everyone see that?
It's still, I can see like a bit of the background. It's not full screen yet. Yeah, there we go. That's perfect.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. As Ellie said, I'm Peter Massini. I'm just going to give a quick sort of overview of, I guess, some of the issues that I've come across dealing with small sites. So I've worked in conservation, green infrastructure for many years, and I do some small site work because essentially a friend of mine's an arboricultural consultant, does lots of small site projects near where I live in Sussex, and needed an ecologist to do some work with him. So I've been taking on sort of small site jobs, which is really interesting because you go to lots of interesting little sites. But the BNG issue has become quite fascinating. And I guess I want to start off by saying I'm not here to sort of decry BNG. I think BNG is a fantastic thing. It just highlights some issues around BNG for small sites, not just for ecologists working in the field, but for local planning authorities and for a lot of small sites developers. And bearing in mind, a lot of developers of small sites are not commercial developers. They're individuals who are wanting to put up a stable in the field or build a holiday let, those kind of things. They're not commercial developers. So just very quickly, what is a small site? Just to make sure everyone's on the same page. So it's a project requiring planning permission, which is either a development of up to 9 dwellings, a development site of less than 0.5 hectares, or developments where the floor space is less than 1,000 square meters. So, and they range in, there's a wide variety of what a small site is. But I guess the ones I'm encountering most, sorry, I'll kind of, just an idea of what small sites are. So this is a small site near where I live in Sussex, actually done before BNG, an old farmyard next to a school on the edge of the village, where 9 units are put in. The sort of developments which local authorities, particularly rural local authorities, are very keen to see implemented because it helps them meet their housing targets, and quite concentrated developments within the village or close to the edge of a village to ensure they're meeting their housing supply needs. But small site developments can also be a site like this. This is a site in Bexhill, and it was someone wanting to build or essentially sell a small part of their garden to build 1 unit on this part of their garden as a small commercial venture. I'm not going to get into whether building on gardens is a good thing. That's a completely separate issue for the planning system. This is more about what the implications with respect to BNG for these kinds of development sites. So I've been to lots of small sites, and typically a small site looks like this. You know, it's a piece of land which is perhaps an existing redundant building, where the client wants to redevelop. Again, lots of garden sites, infill garden sites, where the client wants to put in a development in a large suburban garden. Sites like this, which is a client wanting to convert this stable into a holiday let, and some small sites are building a stable. You know, I've had people come to me saying, "I need planning permission for a stable. I need to do BNG." And lots of other sort of small commercial developments, usually on farmyards, agricultural land, where the landowner is trying to diversify their farm income by doing a small development, either a holiday let or a small sort of business unit, often on land of limited ecological value, to be honest. And sites like this is some people might think, well, perhaps this was a site that was quite interesting, and the developers tried to degrade it by constant mowing. It's actually a site that's been mown for years. It was an overspill car park for a golf course. Now the developer, the golf course, are looking into building some housing units on it. So these are sort of typical small sites that I've been dealing with. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that all small sites like that. There are other small sites I've been to like this, where someone wants to build 2 houses on this piece of woodland, which I doubt they'll get planning permission for, to be perfectly honest, but they were trying to push ahead. Or small sites which are small bits of chalk grassland. So clearly there are some small sites, a site like this, which is a small piece of quite nice neutral grassland. So there are definitely some small sites which have got intrinsic nature conservation value. But my experience is the majority have relatively small ecological interest. Lots of small sites have very large trees on. But again, a site like this was coming up for development. Clearly, when the applicant put in the plan application, they were not suggesting removing that tree. It's fundamental to development. So the development would be on the sort of mown perennial ryegrass in front of that tree. So what's the problem, you might ask? So I just think there are some quirks or flaws in the application of BNG that are of particular relevance when dealing with small sites. And I've tried to sort of summarize those into sort of key issues. So small sites, by definition, little space. The limited utility of the small sites metric. The mathematical problem of small numbers. The trouble with trees, which is quite an interesting issue around small sites and BNG. The red line boundary conundrum. How does my garden grow? The issue around what is a garden, and small sites and potentially big obligations in terms of delivering biodiversity net gain. So I'm going to quickly go through these issues just to highlight the things I think we need to discuss, need to be resolved to make the system work better. And some of these issues are inherent issues with the regulations and the guidance. And I'm sure that many of the issues are also related to local planning authorities, ourselves as consultant ecologists, and applicants still grappling with really trying to understand how BNG works. And some of those might get resolved over time as everyone becomes more knowledgeable about the process. So small sites, little space. So by definition, there's often limited space on a small site. There's small sites. Trying to accommodate a development on a small site and retain or create habitats is actually quite difficult to achieve. And we have to bear in mind that local planning authorities are trying to maximize the development that can be achieved on these small sites, because everyone's in favour of ensuring that small sites, particularly those which were in the development boundary of an existing settlement, are optimising the use of that space for new housing in particular, rather than that housing being shifted onto greenfield sites. And because of this limited ability to achieve BNG on site, in my experience, most small sites, or very, very many small sites, almost always need off-site BNG. You have to go and buy habitat units from a habitat bank. So in a sense, the cost for small developers, the BNG cost per house built is higher than for larger sites, because most larger sites can accommodate quite a lot of BNG on site. So people said, well, why can't a developer just simply reduce the number of units to create more space for on-site BNG? Well, many small sites are applications for just one unit. You can't reduce 1 to 0, but you're not developing the site. And viability is often tight on small sites, and losing one unit can make the project unviable. on much larger sites, losing 1 or 2 units is well within the viability of the site. But on small sites, losing a unit here or there can be quite significant in terms of viability. So that's it around small sites and limited space. So you're all aware of the small sites metric, like a cut down version of the statutory metric, which can be used by a competent person to undertake a B&G assessment. But again, increasingly, it seems to me that the small sites metric is not being used, or certainly not being used by consultant ecologists, for a number of reasons. It can't be used if protected species are present. So it says in the small sites metric, are there protected species? If yes, you can't use a small sites metric. Which begs the question, how do you know unless you've had an ecologist undertake a preliminary ecological appraisal? And if an ecologist undertakes a PEA, they might as well do the B&G assessment, because essentially the information you get for the PEA is the information you need to do the B&G assessment. So again, most small site developers are going down the route of contracting a consultant ecologist because they have to do a PEA, or more often not have to do a PEA, they might as well do the B&G as well. There are some other issues with the small sites metric. It automatically sets a default condition of moderate for all baseline habitats. And this creates a slightly higher bar to achieve B&G if in fact those habitats are in poor condition. And some habitat banks don't accept the information provided by small sites metric when the client needs off-site units. I don't know if that may have changed a bit now, but it does seem a bit of flaw in the thinking that you can't use the SSM to demonstrate the off-site units where small sites often need off-site units. But again, that may have changed. Habitat banks may have become less concerned about taking the SSM for their information. So the problem with small numbers, there's a mathematical issue here that I think it's worth highlighting. Most of you are aware that the B&G score is the relative change between the baseline score and the post-development score. Many small sites have a low baseline score, which is a small number, and a low post-development score, another small number, because they're not doing much B&G on sites. And relative change is sensitive to the scale of the data. A small change between two small numbers can result in a large relative change, but a negligible absolute change. So that's why, particularly in urban areas, on big development schemes, you quite often get huge B&G scores because there was virtually nothing there in the first place. So putting a green roof on a development site where there was virtually no vegetation on the site in the first place results in a huge percentage B&G. But for small sites, when you've got a small baseline and a small post-development score, you get big swings in the B&G percentage change, but tiny, tiny changes in the absolute change. So consequently, for example, on suburban garden sites, the loss of 125 square meters of lawn, meters squared of lawn, would result in a 52% biodiversity net loss, thus requiring 0.026, that's equivalent to 0.026 biodiversity units, and the applicant would have to purchase 0.03 off-site units if they can't do anything on site. So these are tiny, tiny little numbers, but when the local planning authority gets the application, they see this often seemingly huge biodiversity net loss, but it's just a function of a percentage change between two small numbers. So I want to talk a bit about trees. We've got 2 slides about trees because it's quite complex when it comes to trees. So again, those of you who know the metric, individual trees, which are trees that are not part of an existing woodland type habitat, have to be calculated separately. And their value contributes to the total area habitat score at both baseline and post-development. However, unlike other area habitats like grassland or woodland, their baseline value is not determined by the actual area. You don't manage the canopy cover on the site. Instead, you have to use the tree helper, which is embedded in the metric. And this does an automatic calculation of the area of trees on site, but it's based on root protection area. And that tree helper assumes the following: that small trees up to between 7.5 and 30 centimeters down to breast height, have an area of 41 meters squared. Why 41 and not 40? I don't know. Medium trees between 30 and 60 centimeters, an area of 163. These are very precise, specific numbers. Large trees, 366, and very large trees, 765. So on quite a lot of small sites, because the tree metric, the tree helper, is saying every single individual tree is of this area, on quite a lot of small sites, the area of trees, when you're doing the baseline area, is bigger than the area of the site, which seems slightly anomalous. What the tree helper doesn't seem to recognize is that when you have individual trees on site, sometimes they're going quite close together, so their canopies are combined. But it treats them all as separate individual trees, all with individual separate areas. So you often get this anomaly of having small sites where the area of some relatively small trees on site is bigger than the area of the site at baseline. Conversely, when you're doing the post-development area, when you're using trees, it's determined on the size of the tree at planting. So you're not measuring the projected canopy cover, it's just the area at planting. And effectively, the metric states that all newly planted trees should be recorded as small, unless medium or above at the time of planting. Very few developers, even bigger developers, plant really large trees. Virtually every tree that's planted is small, particularly on small sites. No one's going to plant a medium-sized tree or a large tree on a small site. So effectively, when you're doing the calculation, all the trees you plant are classified and recorded as small. So the outcome is that the biodiversity value of individual trees can be overestimated in the biodiversity baseline score and underestimated in the post-development score. And a sort of weird consequence of that, it encourages the retention of as many baseline trees as possible, especially medium-sized trees or above, irrespective of the tree species or its suitability in the sort of post-development scenario. And I've seen projects where, because of the BNG pushing you to retain trees, lots of fairly scrappy, unimportant ecologically trees are retained just to try and maximize the baseline score. And from a landscape design, from a ecology point of view, they're not necessarily good trees to retain, but the BNG pushes you to do that. So red line boundaries. The baseline calculation of BNG is based on the red line boundary, all the habitats within the red line boundary. Those of you who have dealt with small sites, usually the architect just draws the red lines to the property boundary or an obvious sort of fence or other feature on the ground, rather than drawing it to the area that's going to be impacted by the development, which is what you can and should do for many developments. It's just easier to draw it to the property boundary or to some particular obvious fences. So as a consequence, on small sites, there's a higher proportion of land that's not likely to be directly impacted by the development that's included in the red line boundary. And that can have a big effect on the baseline score, again, especially if there are large boundary trees, and that goes back to the issue around trees. So those retained boundary trees in particular, they often comprise the majority of the baseline score, thus making the 10% relative change BNG, 10% BNG requirement difficult to achieve. And increasingly, now people understand this issue, red lines are being drawn to exclude boundary trees, not because people are trying to sort of game the system. Those trees will be retained, they're not impacted. But if you include them in the red line boundary, it massively increases the baseline score for small sites. So gardens, this has come up loads of times. And I did a seminar with the Institute of Garden Designers a few weeks ago. getting into some really arcane discussions around what is and what is not a garden. The first thing to recognise is that because post-development, any garden, private garden, it's got no public access, BNG gains within gardens can't be legally secured. So essentially, anything you do in a garden is just classified as vegetated garden, a low distinctive habitat. If you're planting trees in that garden, they don't get counted towards your BNG. The guidance says you shouldn't record the creation of any other new habitats within private gardens or record enhancement of habitat within private gardens. So on many small sites, the site is being developed for housing, and the site is effectively 2 or 3 houses and gardens. Very little scope to do anything which is technically in the public realm. But because vegetated gardens simply covers everything from a basic turf lawn to a garden that might be planted with trees and shrubs, there's no incentive for the applicant to provide anything other than a turf lawn. It doesn't contribute to the BNG. So it's just encouragable to say, I'll just put some grass down.
Peter, sorry, just a 5-minute warning.
Fine, yeah. And then we come into the issue around the obligations relating to BNG. So clearly, BNG is requiring developers to deliver significant, at least 10% biodiversity net gain. If that's happening on site, the local planning authority wants to secure that, and the regulations and the guidance provides you with issues around habitat management monitoring plans, Section 106 agreements to make sure that that on-site BNG is actually delivered. And significant, this is part of the guidance, it's the inverted commas because it says significant post-development habitats must be managed and maintained for at least 30 years, set out in a habitat management monitoring plan, and secured by a planning obligation, a Section 106 agreement, a legal obligation. Significant is not that well defined in the guidance. It implies that all medium distinct habitats and above are significant. Consequently, when you come to a small site situation, in theory, a single planted cherry tree, which is a medium distinctive habitat, individual tree, could be subject to a Section 106 agreement and a habitat management monitoring plan. We might think, well, what's wrong with that? We want to secure that BNG. But that's hugely burdensome, not just for the applicant, but also for the local planning authority. Negotiating a Section 106 agreement, requiring a habitat management monitoring plan with potentially 4 or 5 monitoring reports for one tree. So many LPAs are now saying, let's not go down that route. That's far too burdensome for us and the applicants for what in effect is a minor landscaping requirement. Yeah, so many LPAs are considering on-site BNG for small sites to be non-significant and simply securing it through condition, as would happen for any landscaping on a small development site. But the applicant still has to submit a biodiversity game plan. That's part of the regulations. So there's sort of overly engineered process for relatively minor issues. So just some very small, some quick conclusions, perhaps not so small conclusions. In some cases, I think often many cases, certainly not all, application of BNG to small sites can be a sledgehammer to crack a nut. It can result in disproportionate burdens for small site applicants, many of whom are not commercial developers. And to me, this is one of the big issues. The cost of the process for both the applicant and the LPA can be more than the cost of delivering the net gain for biodiversity. And the actual ecological outcome is often very small and increasingly is unsecured because you're not going down through the Section 106 agreement. So the gains are small, the cost is high for relatively minor issues. So we've been discussing, my colleagues and others have been discussing this for a while, and perhaps some of the issues around BNG small sites could be resolved by removing or revising small sites metric, because I think increasingly fewer people will use it. Certainly improving the guidance. There's been lots of calls for the guidance to be updated because there's lots and lots of anomalies that apply to BNG as a whole, but has particular implications for small sites. Changing or modifying the de minimis exemption, but perhaps better still is that development of small sites they shouldn't result in net loss of biodiversity, but this might be better achieved by a simple tariff or levy to fund LNRS approved projects. That might be a simpler solution. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to take part in the panel session later on. I think some initial questions now. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Peter. That was really, really interesting, and thank you for sharing your experiences there. So what we'll try and do with the Q&A is we'll try and focus questions that relate directly to Peter's presentation now, and then there'll be some recurring issues that I suspect will come up during the symposium around things like the tariff, which are probably best addressed to everyone when we get to the panel discussion, but there are quite a few questions in the chat box. And firstly, one from Hayley Farnell. Could you quickly mention the problems with bramble scrub, and especially where a small site has been left and taken over by it?
Yeah, so bramble scrub, correct me if I'm wrong, because I sometimes forget these things. I keep referring back to the guidance. It's medium to steep habitat. But it's, what is bramble scrub? You know, lots of small sites, lots of bigger sites, have bramble beginning to develop on site after 2 or 3 years if it's been unmanaged for a while. Yeah, and I've had lots of sites where it's a garden, perhaps it's been left for a couple of years, and there's bits of bramble beginning to appear in the garden. And again, the guidance talks about gardens should be classified as vegetated garden unless there are important habitats. Importance not defined. But I've had challenges saying, well, there's some bramble in the garden. Shouldn't you call that bramble scrub? And clearly it is bramble scrub, but when does bramble scrub become ecologically important? You know, to my mind, 10 square meters of bramble scrub in a suburban garden is not ecologically bramble scrub that might support breeding linnets, for example, or other species. So yeah, it's one of these things that just needs better guidance to explain what bramble scrub means. Because there's bramble scrub everywhere, but surely we aren't recording every single patch of bramble scrub when we're doing BNG assessments.
Brilliant. Thank you, Peter. Have another anonymous question. Do you think it would help if the LPA had more power to decide what area of land the BNG baseline should include? Thinking about those small sites where the red line area is larger than the area that is going to be developed.
Yeah, but it's not the job of the LPA to, I mean, they might give guidance, but it's not the job of the LPA to define the red line boundary. This is something that needs discussion and conversation with architects in particular. Again, the other key issue with BNG with small sites is that BNG works really well when you've got a design team. Small sites don't have design teams. You know, the applicant will commission an architect, an ecologist, and possibly, rarely, a landscape architect. And it's not an iterative, collaborative discussion. It's individuals coming up with their recommendations. And architects, particularly small architects doing lots of small sites, who aren't, again, they're often sole traders or working very small practices, need to get better, more savvy about BNG and thinking through the implications of where they draw the red line boundary. It's something I hadn't really appreciated until BNG became an issue and thinking about the red line boundary. And actually, where you draw the red line boundary, there's no specific guidance. It's what might be affected by the development. So many architects just simply take a cautious view and draw a big red line boundary. And increasingly, people are saying, don't do that.
Thank you, Peter. Couple of questions around trees. So one that you covered, I think, but can you elaborate on how best to deal with the issue where a tree trunk might be outside or on the boundary, but the canopy extends into the site, and how do you assess the loss of that as a result of development?
Yeah. So as I said, we're increasingly telling architects to make sure they draw the red line boundary on to exclude those trees, but clearly they're boundary trees. But I think we need to recognise that BNG is not the only part of the planning system. You know, there are consultants doing a lot of work on these sites, and it's the ARB consultant will say they'll be considering trees outside the red line boundary and saying you need to do X, Y, and Z to retain that tree, and that's a separate conversation with the LPA about retention of trees. I think people think that BNG is the mechanism to deal with all these issues, but actually there's lots and lots of very good guidance and expertise around retention of trees. And again, something that's come up, work I do, is there wasn't much discussion between ARB consultants and ecologists as the BNG regulations were being developed. And a lot of ARB consultants are now scratching their heads going, hang on a minute, I'm telling you to take that tree out. And the BNG is saying, no, keep it in.
Thank you. I'm going to squeeze in one quick question, but it can probably be a one-word answer, or a yes or no. So we know that the relationship between diameter at breast height of a tree and canopy cover and lots of other things like root volume, we know that really well for individual species of trees. Do you think the tree helper would be improved, or do you think we'd be massively overcomplicating things by having that level of resolution to look at differences between species?
I think it would make it much more complicated. I just think we need to be working with, most small sites have an ARB consultant working on the site, and there just needs to be some drawing up with the ARB consultant and almost taking the lead from the ARB consultant.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much. That was a really insightful presentation. I'm going to hand back to Ellie now to introduce our next speaker.
Thanks, Mark. And yeah, just to echo Mark, thanks, Peter. That was really excellent. I particularly enjoyed the musings on when is a bramble scrub not a bramble scrub. It's quite philosophical. Maybe a blog post on that coming soon or something. Great. So yeah, our next speaker is Alexa Culver, who is legal counsel at RSK Wilding and was previously general counsel at Natural Capital Specialists, the Environment Bank. She's a member of the College of Experts at the Office for Environmental Protection and was recognised in the ENDS Report Power List as one of the most impactful environmental lawyers of 2023 and also in this year's list in 2025. As a lawyer with over 16 years experience working on land, planning, environmental and green finance projects, Alexa helps to inform policy development and natural capital regulation and designs legal contracts, leases and conservation covenants that maximise natural capital value through novel and enduring financial, legal and governance mechanisms.
I
was proud of myself that I got all of those words up, to be honest.
That's awful. I've got to change that.
Over to you, Alexa.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Ellie. Let me share my screen. And how long have I got to make sure I get this right?
You've got maximum 25 minutes, and I'll give you a 5-minute warning when you're at 20 minutes.
Lovely. And can you all see my
Yeah, I can see that perfect.
Wonderful. So I'm with RSK Wilding, which is part of the RSK Biocensus group of companies. And my job over these last few years, both in this role and in my previous role, is to set up habitat banks in anticipation of biodiversity net gain becoming a mandatory requirement, as it did back in February 2023. Oh God, I can't believe I don't know which one that is.
2024.
It feels like it's been, thank you. It feels like it's been here a long time, and certainly, like Peter was rightly highlighting, there's been a few teething problems with it. So I'm here to highlight some of the key legal elements of the framework, but also really to focus on those bits that can help to ease some of the bottlenecks here. And hopefully this can be a useful resource for anyone here. These slides can come to anybody afterwards. And yeah, really looking forward to any questions you might have. So, first of all, my absolute Bible for anything to do with BNG is always the planning practice guidance. The beautiful thing about the planning practice guidance is that it is designed to tell us about how BNG interacts with the planning system. It's detailed, it's clearly written, and it usually answers any question I ever have. So if anybody is stuck, I go to the planning practice guidance on biodiversity net gain and Control F and try and find a word related to what I'm trying to find out, and usually you can find it here. So then Peter was rightly flagging, and as part of this topic for this session, is what are the key smaller sites problems? And boy, have I seen there have been a lot of challenges at points. And for a while, it was quite, on LinkedIn, there'd be a lot of questions, a lot of confusion. There's a Facebook group as well, which I'm part of, and you can just see some real frustrations about how this new policy works. A lot of that has been, my personal perspective is that there wasn't quite enough government investment in implementation. The Planning Advisory Service did a truly valiant job of looking to upskill and inform the planning authorities all across the country, but in the context of chronic underfunding and overburdens, I think that there could have been better funding, better burden funding, and better investment in implementation. I think that delayed BNG coming to a full fruition as everybody had hoped it would have done. So one of the key issues is proportionality. How do we make sure that people aren't being required to do outrageously ridiculous, overcomplicated things on site? And one place I go to here, it's a bit dry and boring, but it's actually paragraph 9 of Schedule 7A to the Town and Country Planning Act. When you're dealing with on-site habitats, the planning authority has complete discretion over whether gains are to be treated as significant. Peter's right that when you're looking at some of the guidance around it, it can be a bit complicated. But the crux of this is in the legislation itself. Planning authorities decide whether it's significant or not. They can really exercise their discretion. If they think it is significant, then it can be bound either by a planning condition, a planning obligation, or a conservation covenant. If it isn't significant, it doesn't need to be bound by anything at all. So it's really important to make sure that this myth busting, the local authorities do need to feel empowered and confident to recognise they decide if it's significant. And if it isn't significant, there is no need for any legal obligations for 30 years. So any way I can spread that word far and wide, I'm keen to, and please do share it far and wide, because that's the first step in ensuring proportionality here. If it's disproportionately pathetic, the impact on biodiversity, then there is no need for anybody to go through this pain of 30 years agreements. Rightly though, there should be a process to understand whether what is there is significant or not. And that to me is a crucial thing, because while small sites are individually small by their nature, their impacts may be huge depending on what's on site, and cumulatively, there is a huge impact across our country. So it's important to remember it's worth understanding what's there. If it is not relying on significant on-site gains, there is no need for any legal agreements at all. And again, would love to talk to anybody till I'm blue in the face about that. So exemptions, another challenge, because like Peter says, does the de minimis exemption need a bit of work, because there has been confusion over exactly how they apply. Again, my view is the exemptions are a temporary measure. The primary act of the Environment Act, highlights that exemptions are a temporary measure to try to help to ease the sector into this. And so while the exemptions may have initially caused some confusion, again, perhaps because of a slight underinvestment in the education and the implementation around all of this, only just this month, the Planning Advisory Service has provided some excellent new guidance on this, rightly responding to the calls from Peter and others that we could do with a bit of a steer here. So I found it on LinkedIn, and there's a link here, which of course you can all have with the slides, but it's a brilliant paper that just explains how to navigate it. Because the point is that it's really important to get biodiversity right on your schemes, no matter what the size. And it's really important to be confident that you benefit from the de minimis exemption before any further work is done. So just understand what you're dealing with, and then remember that how it is then dealt with is going to be proportionate to what is on your site or not. We've also got to remember that there are issues around how this interacts with other policies. Again, Peter flagged about how we deal with individual trees and how there are other policies involved in the planning system that also deal with trees. So urban greening factor and similar, means that local authorities local communities are all rightly concerned about the loss of canopy cover, the loss of green spaces in densely populated areas in the city. So even if it seems like a sort of pathetic, scraggly, unexciting to look at tree that's on site, it is an habitat, an established habitat for important biodiversity and creatures, great and small, but it's established, and that's what's critical here. It might not be beautiful, but it's established, and it's performing a really important role of providing islands of green space in often highly urban environments. So again, the metric is looking to try to recognise that losing an established tree just isn't good news for the environment. And this is more than just making pretty places for human beings. This is about preserving important established habitats. So remember that while it might feel like a burden to address this through the biodiversity metric, like Peter rightly says, there are already other pressures to retain habitats on your site. And again, local planning authorities can exercise their discretion in deciding ultimately what is the right thing. Does it really make sense to retain this tree here ecologically? And they can always open to sensible arguments about that. So it's worth remembering that these things are not set in stone, and local authorities do have a great deal of discretion over what to suggest and how to apply things like this, things like whether to legally bind it or not, the land that is, and also whether or not it's better off to contribute to an off-site scheme as opposed to retaining what's on site after following the biodiversity gain hierarchy. So, recognising some of these smaller sites issues, at RSK, we have happily opened up a completely free of charge BNG clinic for smaller sites specifically. It's already happened by accident, if you like, because I'm approached frequently on LinkedIn, and we get phone calls frequently from people asking about how to deal with this and how to deal with that. And so I want to really highlight that you can contact us by email on these email addresses. Always copy me in, and we'll call you right back, because very often it just takes a signpost to a bit of the metric, a signpost to the planning practice guidance, and we're here to help the planning authorities, the planning officers, the developers, the ecologists. We're really keen to help because we really want to see this push through into a successful, easy, and ideally frictionless place, and we're almost there. So we've got the mitigation hierarchy as one of the key smaller sites issues. There is this question of, why are we retaining this silly thing on site when really we'd be so much better to just, get rid of it and go off site? Well, again, local planning authorities have discretion over how to apply a mitigation hierarchy. And if it doesn't make any sense to deliver your gains on site, if it makes no ecological sense to deliver those gains on site, then you are rightly then able to buy biodiversity units, which are now increasingly becoming available more and more locally and at fractional units to support these small site schemes. And again, just getting confident in how you articulate and present your mitigation hierarchy, demonstrate that you have looked to see whether these things could be retained, but have decided against it for various good, sound, ecological and proportionate reasons. So again, make the most of that discretion, because the alternative, and this is a dangerous alternative, is we go to cash to trash. And we just say, pay us some money. It doesn't matter what's there. Don't try and avoid what's there. Just bung some money in a pot. And as appealing as that might sound, that's a dangerous precedent for us to set. And we're actually already seeing government move towards these kinds of ideas in Part 3 of the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, which I'm not sure how familiar people are with this. It's currently in its passage through Parliament. But their government is trying to say, well, it's all a bit too complicated to try to avoid harms to nature. Why don't people just pay money into a pot, and maybe some compensation might be delivered at some point later? I think the danger with that is, one, it will mean that we're accelerating the decline of nature, even on small sites, getting rid of biodiversity and established habitats in exchange for potentially some future habitat somewhere else, possibly one day, possibly getting delivered. is only going to accelerate the decline of nature. And that's not something I'd feel excited about watching happening on a policy level on our watch when we've made so much excellent progress. Second, we know that big pots of cash actually don't often get spent. Even House Builders Federation themselves think that the local authorities in England are holding on to something like £8 billion worth of payments that developers have made in things like Section 106 contributions and community infrastructure levy that simply has not been spent. And it sounds crazy to think, why is this happening? Well, again, the Rivers Trust, they had over £11 million in fines that had been paid by water companies that again wasn't being spent on river restoration projects. And government was even eyeing up nicking that 11 million and spending it on other stuff. The real challenge with big pots of cash is, I know from first-hand experience, and as do many here on this session, actually securing the land needed for delivery of nature restoration projects, making sure it's funded properly, making sure you've got the right people on board, making sure the scheme design is as it should be, is a long and difficult process. And to just send money into a pot of cash could lead to really dangerous declines in nature. And really sadly as well, the loss of trust between local communities and developers, because local communities are relying on developers taking nature seriously in their local areas and relying on robust, nationally level playing field laws that prevent the trashing of nature, which may never be compensated for. You can see that already Part 3 of the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, which is like a massive kind of tariff system as proposed, where they're expecting any environmental feature, including ancient woodland, for example, to be something that a developer could just pay a levy to trash. You can see already, only over these last weeks, extreme tensions stoking up between the development sector and local people and wildlife charities, because it's a ginormous step back from the progress that we've made in all of us pulling together to deliver sustainable development, understanding what our harms are, avoiding our harms as much as we can, and then as a last resort compensating for those harms. And that's something that Biodiversity Net Gain has enshrined within it. And that's an accidental slide that I've already shown you. And so I've actually already come to the end of my slides. So if people want, they can ask questions now, of course, or we could save it till later, whatever people would like to do.
Thank you, Alexa. We do have some questions that have come through.
Brilliant.
I think I'm just going to channel Jason for a few minutes and just draw people's attention to the resources that CIEEM have available on our webpage to support people's understanding of the bill. Because you mentioned cash to trash and the planning and infrastructure bill. So we'll pop a link in the chat box, but even if you just Google CIEEM and planning and infrastructure bill, we tried to curate all of the resources that we have, including the webinars and how to write your MP type guides in one place. So I'd really encourage everyone to have a look at that one. Okay. So in terms of questions, so we do have a couple in the chat box. So one of them is, do you think that we're seeing more retrospective applications to avoid the statutory framework?
I suspect there may be in this transitional period, some people going at, looking at ways that they can avoid an obligation to nature, and that's, I think, to be expected. I think that there's work already afoot to, if it hasn't already even happened, to make it not possible to use retrospective applications to avoid biodiversity gain requirements. I can triple check that, but I've seen either an announcement that that's coming in to close that loophole, or it has already come in.
Brilliant, thank you, Alexa. And then I think there's a point here from Rosie Wichlow. From an LPA perspective, we are using conditions in some situations to be proportionate, and from her understanding, other LPAs across England are doing similar.
Yeah, exactly. Hi, Rosie, by the way. We're sort of LinkedIn friends.
Great, thank you, Rosie. It's a point from me. So you point out that it's for the LPA to determine what's significant, but that very few LPAs have provided that definition, so that there's a danger that the applicant and the LPA go around in circles. On one hand, that seems like a quick win in terms of us being able to support LPAs, ALGE and PAS. But do you think there's a broader issue there around LPAs having the necessary confidence in their judgment and the necessary
100%.
experience?
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't even stop myself from jumping in.
It's fine.
Absolutely. You know, what we're all witnessing here is the unfortunate side effect of bolting robust policy onto a planning system that has been in a state of turmoil for quite a long time. And so I think that we're witnessing LPAs struggling to have the resource or the confidence or the funding to address these kinds of concerns. And of course, it's easy to not quite pick up on how much discretion you do actually have. So I think in Leeds, for example, they just decided that anything that delivers more than 3 biodiversity units of gain on site is significant. Now, I know there's DEFRA guidance and the guidance looks a bit complicated and maybe that could be made a bit easier. But the real important thing, and Nick White at Natural England is at pains to say this so much, it's triage, triage, triage. Just know what's there, understand what's there, and then behave proportionately. But crucially, you've got to know what's there first. And that's, I think, a really important part.
Thank you, Alexa. Peter's itching to come in here,
Yeah,
and I think that's okay given we've got time. You are on mute, Peter.
I just wanted to jump in on this significant issue and going back to the triage. I know Naturally you said that from the outset, but no one knows how to do that.
Yeah,
It's
totally.
Like, what does that mean? Because it's a legal requirement to review these applications. Just on the significant issue, it's a really weird thing because it says it's significant or non-significant. It's for the local authority to determine that, because when you get to the biodiversity gain plan set stage, which is the applicants filling in, it asks you the question, is it significant? Well, who determines that? I mean,
The LPA, I mean, exactly.
Yeah,
so maybe we can
the
make sure
LPAs
they
are not doing
understand that.
So at some point, someone's got to make a decision, and it's been put on the applicant to decide whether it's significant.
Yeah, well, the
And most
biodiversity
applicants will
gain.
say, well, no.
Well, yeah, because of course they have to present all of their initial information, and lots of LPAs have got really ahead of the game and they've made sure that their validation lists require the right information to help them decide right away whether what's being delivered on site is something that they would consider to be significant. That should be something that's addressed early doors.
But virtually, I've not seen any local planning authority with that information anywhere.
Oh, let me ping you because I've been keeping an eagle eye out. And you're right. And I think, and again, like Mark says, you know, we could be doing more to help LPAs understand this, you know, and that's sort of why I went nuts on that slide as my first slide, because actually this, and like Rosie's already said, like, so we can help, the Planning Advisory Service can help, but like Mark says, this is the symptom of imposing good, robust policy onto a system that didn't get the investment it needed to be able to implement correctly or rapidly enough. Totally. But anything we can do to raise that awareness, you know, CIEEM is there, we're here, Planning Advisory Service is there, you know, and they're responding to this excellent sector feedback like they are with the de minimis exemption guidance. So anything that can help LPAs to have that confidence, I think it could be our primary focus as a group here.
Absolutely. But in the meantime, everyone's going,
Yeah, exactly. And so anything we can do to take that stress away feels to me like the easiest route to unblock.
Thank you. And there's a kind offer from Rosie in the chat there. So London Borough of Brent point of view, they produced a draft approach to significance based on what they feel is significant in the context of an urban borough in Greater London. So likely to be different in rural areas. But happy to send that template across.
Just make one point. I mean, the BNG process was supposed to make things more uniform. And we're already starting to get to the point now everyone's making their own decisions about, well, what does significant?
Yeah, and you're so right there, Peter, because again, what you've got here is now we've got a uniform framework that actually means you can buy 0.25 units of a biodiversity unit from a habitat bank that's already been made. And then, of course, you just can't take away the democratic ability for local people to decide what is important to them. So this creates a framework that allows a degree of autonomy, but the availability of solutions on a more strategic level. And I think that works well. You've got to measure what you're dealing with, look online on the magic maps to see if there are any priority habitats recorded there. You don't need to necessarily have an ecologist out there on a small sites where there's no indication that any priority habitats are likely to be there. Yes, I mean, that's
species?
well, the species is separate, of course, isn't it?
Yeah, but
you
can't use the SSM without if protected species might be present.
Yeah, well, yeah, but no, that's priority habitats, isn't it? So it's totally separate to the species regime. So it's the rules of using a small site metric. If there are any priority habitats that are likely to be present, that's when you've got to identify them.
Or protected species.
So protected species, what, like a newt? If there's a newt there, you can't do your BNG with a small sites metric.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's new to me. Newt to me.
I think Newt, Alexa, I can't believe you said that. Okay, I think there's some issues around species there that we can probably pick up in the panel discussion later on. And there are no more questions coming up in the Q&A box. And there are some helpful comments in the webinar chat about guidance that's available.
Really excited to welcome our next speaker, Oliver Lewis. Oliver, CBE, is the founder and CEO of Joe Bloom's, specialising in supporting small sites comply with the BNG process. He and his company have been cited as experts in the field by Natural England, and Oliver previously worked in Number 10 for a number of prime ministers on matters relating to international affairs. So over to you, Oliver.
Thank you so much, Ellie, and good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm just going to share my screen. 1 second. Can I just confirm, Ellie, that you can see my screen okay?
Yeah, I can see that great.
Perfect. Well, as I say, good morning, everyone, and it's a real pleasure to be here and to speak to you all today. And it's a particular pleasure to be following both Peter and Alexa and their excellent presentations. The presentation that I'm going to do is called Small Sites Analysis, 9 Months of Digital Success. And to quickly explain that title, it's called 9 months because it's based on an analysis that we did at the end of last year. In fact, there's new numbers that have come out over the last 5 months, and throughout the presentation, I'll give sort of slight preview on how those numbers have changed. But I also want to emphasize the digital there as well, because I actually agree a lot with a lot of Peter's comments on some of the issues, some of the quirks of the small site metric. And I want to emphasize here that what I'm going to be focusing on and talking about is how digital solutions have stepped up to address those problems and to make sure that BNG operates effectively. So a quick preview of the next 15-20 minutes of my presentation. I want to say a little bit about who we are and what we do, and why we think we've got something to offer to this conversation. Do a sort of macro take on why small sites are, to our mind, so important and a vital component of the entire BNG process. Talk about some of the changes we'd like to see, because very, very strongly of the view that things do need to change and improve. I very strongly agree with Peter's line that we need to revise certain parts of it. And then a bit of a caution, where I would respectfully disagree with some of Peter's recommendations, is that we need to go down a more evolution rather than revolution approach to solving the small site quandaries. So just a little bit about ourselves first. Joe Bloom's is a company which we set up in 2022. Just as a quick aside, the company is named after my brother who passed away. We are a group of people who were committed to seeing BNG work, but we saw that there would be issues on the small site dimension. We took the view that the way to make this work would be to develop digital tools to help both applicants and LPAs be able to move at pace through a best practice process to produce BNG solutions for sites. To that end, we realised we had to set up a company to get the funds needed to create those digital tools. We also were able to partner with the planning portal, as well as working with people in DEFRA and Natural England to make sure we were fully compliant. Since we all went live in April of last year, we've had over 25,000 people use our digital tools, one or more of them. It's worth saying that even though we're a company, we believe in the ability of BNG to really transform the environment. And to that end, we do seek to make sure that we're helping people as much as possible. Over 90% of people who use our tools pay nothing. We provide free advice as much as we can. And where people do pay for the end-to-end service, We aim to keep those costs down, because I completely agree with Peter's take that it's really important that solutions, people don't end up paying more for B&G solutions than for wider costs or actually improving the environment. As we increase our volume of sales as well, we aim to bring down prices. I'm very pleased to say that while in our first year we were able to keep costs for most people below £500, that cost point is lowering already. We have a firm commitment that we can help people get all the way through the B&G process. When it is truly unviable, we refund the user for that. Last year we had a success rate of 98% on that basis, and it looks like it's going to be higher this year as we continue to improve and iterate the tool. Now, I'm here not as a necessarily representative of Joe's Blooms, but of the wider digital sector, because there are a whole group of digital services who are emerging in this space, and I'll talk about some of them, some of the other ones in this space. But I just want to say a few words right from the outset, which is digital tools have a role to play, but it's a very clearly defined role. Emphatically, we are not here to replace ecologists or to try and step into any of that space, but rather be a supporting role. We're here to make sure that ecologists and consultants have the tools they need to discharge a B&G duty on small sites quickly and effectively, but maintain the higher standards. And yes, there is a role for digital tools in supporting the competent person, but only when it is clearly the case that they meet the criteria set out in the small site metric. And for those individuals, we want to make sure that we can use the capacity of digital tools to guide, to steer, explain, and maximise the chances of best practice being followed. I have a screenshot here of our tool where the point about gardens that was raised earlier is flagged to users, helping to guide them, making sure that they don't make mistakes, but also to encourage best practice. So we have an independent panel of a group of ecologists, including people like Professor David Goulson, who give us advice on how we can not just make sure we comply with the metric, but also encourage best ecological practice within the tool and steer people in the right way. Now, we need to do more in this space. So one of the things that we're committed to is always seeking to engage more with ecological bodies, consultancies, etc., so we can improve a tool, make sure we act more effectively as a filter, sending people and connecting applicants and ecologists as much as we can. We need to improve and learn from how B&G works in practice, but also, and critically, we need to make sure that we ever more incorporate local requirements. So engaging with LPAs, LPA ecologists, to make sure that the local requirements are embedded into the flow, so that not just make sure that people aren't just complying with B&G at a national level, but also with local requirements too. Now, worth saying that when you use right, we find that digital tools can deliver some wonderful results. I'm more than happy to talk about some of this in the Q&A or in a panel at the end. But just to say, we've had some really great case studies that when you have digital tools, i.e. the ability to actually map things out, share designs between a single applicant and maybe the architect or the LPA officer, you see this incredible iteration as people can suddenly engage, move things around on the map, make suggestions. And we see people actually, for example, this one here, where 3 units were being built in a very large garden, actually the ability was found to actually create space, a public space around the garden, cutting it out for the wider community and creating some really exciting gains, well in excess of 100%. Now, what I will say is that small sites, to our mind, are incredibly important. They have a big, big impact. This is not to say that we think that they are flawed, it's a perfect system. Of course not. As I said before, very strongly agree with Peter's comments that there are some serious quirks which need to be addressed. In fact, in many ways, the fact that we exist at all is because we recognise there's issues with the small site metric approach. We thought that there needed to be tools to help guide people through it. But critically, when we were setting up the company, we read and reread and reread again the government's 2019 impact assessment, which noted that if you introduce broad exemptions or allow basically small sites to opt out entirely, any way of doing that could lead to a real risk of the entire policy collapsing. So in fact, actually what was needed was not to think about how we can remove small sites from the scope of B&G, but how to make it viable, how to make people more easily and effectively engage with it in the right way. Of course, the big problem is the Excel sheet, and Peter's talked a lot about it, and I agree with a lot of his comments. But obviously digital tools, things that are intuitive and allow people to interface with it effectively are a big, big help here. And it's worth saying that some of the issues that we've encountered that both Alexa's mentioned and Peter, we think can be fixed with both a combination of specific changes to the metric. And it's great that DEFRA has made clear that one, it's already introduced some changes, but is prepared to go further. And then also better guidance, which obviously Alexa's already mentioned as well. We think that if you have those strategic changes, in fact, a lot of the problems that we've encountered over the last year or so can be addressed. It's also worth saying that while we know there's a lot of concern and a lot of understandable criticism and frustration with the small site metric, there hasn't been any evidence that we are aware of systemic problems in planning as a result of the B&G process being brought out. We are partners with the planning portal, so we discuss the data with them a lot. We were actually brought in to try and make sure that there wasn't any sort of ongoing problems with the planning process as a result of B&G being introduced and applies to more and more sites. And to date, we haven't seen any evidence. Yes, there's a lot of evidence of frustration, surveys showing that there's anger with certain parts of it, but frustration is not the same as policy failure. And we think that so long as there is no evidence of failure, we should work to try and make the system better and work as intended. So why do small sites matter? So it's interesting, Peter's numbers here, he's completely right that taken in isolation, small sites can seem very small. I think his numbers were 0.03 or 0.025. In preparation for this, I did a random sample of 100 of users who did the Joe's Blooms tool, and we found that the change was 0.05. Seems little, why does it matter? The whole point, and I think Alexa mentioned this, is volume. Small sites add up in a really big way. In theory, if you use the government's definitions and claims over the last few years of the number of applications who should do biodiversity net gain, it adds up incredibly fast. In fact, were B&G to apply as intended, you should expect to see orders of the magnitude of 35 biodiversity units across the country per day, or nearly 13,000 in a year. Added together, just to put that into context, that could be seen as 27 million meters squared per year of good quality moderate grassland, or 32 million meters squared of woodland. And so I think actually you put it in that context, you realize that all these little parts of small sites add up in a really big way that matters to the country. And if you think those numbers aren't particularly persuasive, just bear in mind that over time as well, these compound. So let's take, for example, the spatial multiplier. If people were to go off-site, you actually, in 10 years' time, you are seeing gigantic amounts of habitat being created as a result specifically of the small site metric. We could easily see, in putting that woodland context, the size of 6 Manchesters being created over the course of 10 years. It really does matter and add up together. The analogy that I like to use, and I realize it's not a perfect analogy, is it's a bit like saying, well, I'm just going to throw a Coca-Cola bottle in the field. Doesn't matter, it's just one bottle. Earth is huge, so what? But we have seen, and we've had this debate over the last few decades, of actually these things do add up, and it causes huge societal problems. And so what I would say is, if you agree that people shouldn't be free just to throw their litter because every little bit does add up, we should agree with the logic that every small ecological negative impact on a site should be mitigated in order to prevent a systemic, large, cumulative problem. So this is why we think that actually small sites do matter. And while there are genuinely issues, and I'll talk about some of them now, what we need to do is address them rather than sort of say, let's just throw it all away. Now, first of all, I'd say that actually the situation has already improved materially from our perspective. And we've seen some of the things that caused real headaches in the sort of first few months of B&G going live, sort of April to August time last year, being solved. The big one that has improved is the availability of offsite units. Now, there was both a question of supply of available units, which was a real frustration, but more and more offsite supplies have become available. But also critically, we've started to see digital tools appear which are able to facilitate those transactions. So before, really big questions about, well, you can't buy a fractional unit, it's a nightmare, had to buy one unit or something like that. Now we've seen services like BNGX start to appear, and full disclosure, we have a relationship with this company, but they're able to facilitate immediate transactions of fractional units. And also critically, we've seen the prices start to come down more and more, and as a result, more and more people willing to purchase those small quantities of biodiversity units and make that national market available. Also worth saying, and I think Peter mentioned this before, we have seen, as a result, partly of digitization and these tools that allow those transactions, more and more offsite providers able to use small site metrics. So those frictions are starting to be resolved. That said, there are still absolutely some frustrations and things that I think that the government need to address. The big one, to my mind, and the thing we definitely see the most frequently, is gardens. Now, Peter set out the problems, I think, far better than I can. But there's no doubt that after the government issued its clarifications last year, there were more headaches regarding gardens. It does just prove extremely restrictive. Now, what we have seen is that there have been ways that we've been able to engage with local authorities using the tool to easily map out new ideas and approaches. I have a photo here of what a solution that a few LPAs have done on certain sites, where actually the applicant's been willing to carve off part of the garden, planting saplings or other gains as well in a publicly accessible way, which has seemed to work for the LPA's perspective. But again, this is where digital tools have proven really effective in that all sorts of new designs can be mapped out. And so joining Zoom calls in a matter of half an hour, literally mapping out new ideas with an officer, with an applicant, coming up with solutions which can work well and effectively. And I mean, to my mind, allowing more gains on gardens in a sensible way, which addresses the understandable concerns that were raised regarding, how can these be retained? To my mind, the obvious thing is, why can't we look at infrastructure, bird boxes, bat bricks, etc. All of these ideas which were, tossed around a few months ago. You can see how there would be ways of bedding in permanent infrastructure into gardens and others, which would clearly materially improve the biodiversity value of a garden in a sustained way, which should be explored. On guidance, I think that is an absolutely key point, and obviously something that we've all come to a few times. I completely agree with the points that Alexa made regarding proportionality and the need to make sure that that is spread across far and wide and make sure people understand that. In terms of the approaches, I think so red lines were definitely an issue that we encountered. I think someone mentioned that before as well. What we've found is that more and more officers are prepared to enter into sensible conversations with the applicant on where should a red line move. Again, digital tools are great because the ability to vary the red line and see what is possible or not allows a very quick sort of approach of different scenarios, what is sensible, what is proportionate. We need to make sure there's more guidance here about what is the right approach in the era of BNG for determining the red line. In terms of significance, I think that's been talked about to death, but I think the point that Alexa made on legal position is key. In fact, the more we can actually direct people to that and make sure people understand that, it removes a huge amount of the uncertainty in the system. And it would also address one of the big problems we're seeing come up again and again, which is about that proportionality. To our minds, BNG can absolutely work on small sites, but things like habitat management monitoring plans are usually overkill. And so it'd be good to see actually a system we can move into that. And we can talk about the competence question as well, because at the moment, the criteria of what is a competent person has a degree of subjectivity in it. It'd be really useful to be able to bring that out a little bit more and find a more sensible way. But again, it's all about guidance, clarifying and clearly setting out how it's supposed to work, so LPAs and applicants can have the confidence of navigating this system. A case study actually on this, which is a European protected species. And I think, again, this has been mentioned before. One of the things that we were developing the tool, we realized the paradox, which I think Peter set out, which is, hold on, European protected species, you can't use the small site metric. Well, hold on, isn't that a contradiction? So we spent a matter of, I think, months in the end, going between different officials in DEFRA, Natural England and others, trying to get to the bottom of this, until it was pointed out to us that actually this question has been asked for many, many years within the planning process. In fact, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of applications have already been asked this over the last few years, in that they're asked, are there protected priority species on the site? And the key way that this was navigated was the small applicant was asked, is there a reasonable likelihood of this? Now, the whole way we've done it now in order to accommodate it for the competent person is giving a whole range of tools to help them determine whether or not there's a reasonableness criteria there, but also critically let it be amendable, so that if it turns out that a user has used a small site metric, try to make a reasonable determination, but then it turns out there is an issue, when actually we can reverse it, we can refund the user in that case. But the key point is that this whole question of, is there a reasonable likelihood, that should be made available to everyone right from the get-go. So, this is sort of an area where guidance would just really, really help solve some of these problems. Now, I'm just bringing my remarks to a close, but I do want to say that we do think that some of the radical solutions proposed are, to our mind, not a good idea. Very much in the space of revolution is not the right approach. We need to look for evolution. So with deep respect, disagree with some of the policy proposals that have been set out. Now, we've talked a bit about levies, and I want to say how strongly I agree with the points Alexa made before about the problems with levies. Historically have not worked, and I think Alexa set out the examples of the River Trust and others, those levies not being well spent. I just put up some headlines of, just in the last few months, further examples of levies just not being spent on what they were intended to, for understandable reasons. There's all sorts of legal horrors in terms of spending these kinds of funds. I think we have to be honest with ourselves that history has shown again and again and again that if you move to a levy system, you should not expect that money to end up on nature restoration projects. It's going to disappear into a pot and probably never come out. So I think we just need to be honest about ourselves about the limitations of this. It's also worth saying that I don't think it's going to be limited to a small number of sites. If you just say, oh, well, just this certain criteria, we've already seen campaigns emerge saying that the definition of small sites should expand to encompass up to 50 units. If we move into an area where some can opt out for a levy, it won't be long before more and more and more applicants can move into that space. And it's worth, I think Alexa mentions as well, we need to bear in mind the political context. At the moment, you have the Planning and Infrastructure Bill going through Parliament, and as the impact assessment and documents have made clear, and ministers have made clear, their intention is to move to a whole new approach to ecology and planning. They want to see they want to see basically the end, from my reading, of site surveys full stop. So what I would say is, I completely disagree with this approach, and it'd be really, really bad to see, to encourage this kind of trend in my mind.
Sorry, Oliver, just a 5-minute warning. I know you're wrapping up anyways.
Thank you so much. And it's also worth saying as well, we've seen with still numbers that simple payments in quote marks can lead to some horrific results as well. I just put some headlines of that. So I do urge caution on levies, but I urge an even stronger caution when it comes to exemptions. Planning Portal has released data, and obviously Planning Portal accounts for about 95% of all planning applications in England. Since B&G went live, we've seen 75% of all applicants claiming that they are exempt from B&G. And this is applicants who, in theory, should fall within the remit of it. So this is not including household extensions. This is all for the full pool applications. And it's worth saying that overwhelmingly, that is because of the de minimis threshold. So in other words, people saying, well, 25 meters squared are not impacted has been taken as a way of bypassing B&G for a huge proportion of applications to date. So if we do say, well, let's expand the de minimis exemption, we should not think, oh, we're only exempting those sites who are, 30 meters, 40 meters. You're going to see huge numbers of people take that de minimis and try and apply it to their site. So in fact, I think you should expect to see, if you do expand the de minimis exemption, you're not just removing a few more sites, you're in all likelihood dramatically increasing the number of people who'll be opting out and creating serious questions about the viability of the policy itself. So just to wrap up very quickly, I do think there's things that we need to do from ourselves and from our positions. We need to make sure that we work intersectionally as well. We need to make sure that ecologists, digital providers, LPA officers can all interact. We want to make ourselves fully available, making sure that the tools do exactly what people need and offer that supporting role. But in terms of, actually improving it and addressing those problems, I think that, what has been set out in this conversation so far is that the same issues come up again and again, and they can be solved either with specific changes, e.g. for gardens, or for clarity and guidance on very specific points, be it the significance points, red lines, or indeed European protected species. And what I would just say to wrap up is this. We've heard a lot about how specific things can cause problems. So let's work on solving those specific problems rather than saying let's remove the entire thing. If you do go down the route of exemptions and levies, we risk not just harming B&G, but in the political environment we're in at the moment, creating, basically pouring petrol on a fire, which says that ecology, site surveys as a whole should go. That would be a disaster for our planet. I think let's work instead to fix those problems. And I just want to say thank you. And please do not only get in touch with us, with myself in the questions to come, but also going forward, we'd love to hear from you and work together.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Oliver. And I echo the points that you've made. I think it's really good to have a solutions focused presentation, and we need to make sure that we are getting behind this really, and we need to be mindful of the impact that these conversations have on policymakers. and the general respect for our profession as well. So I've got some specific kind of technical questions about Joe's blooms. And also some questions about management. So one is anonymous question. So intrigued by your example of 100% gain by allowing publicly accessible space around 3 units, and some of that space looked small, maybe just a couple of meters. So how would that space be managed for 30 years? And a related question is who would manage publicly accessible margins?
Brilliant questions. So, in short, the way we do approach this is we try and make sure that every case on BNG is obviously sui generis, it's unique. So what we do is we try and facilitate those conversations between the LP officers and the applicant as well. So obviously, you know, there'll be a Section 106 or conservation covenant or something like that. You know, it's usually either the homeowner or landowner who takes on those responsibilities, is our experience of that. But basically, it's the realization to go, well, actually, we're quite happy to maintain this section of land because even though it's slightly fenced off from the garden, it is in effect our land. But obviously it's case by case. So is that person in an ability, has the capacity to do so? You know, and then that's usually some interesting conversation. But what we find is that by being able to find a solution quickly, we move on to a really sensible conversation about, well, who's well placed to do that? And so rather than like spending all our time, is it viable? Oh, this is a nightmare, more red cells in the Excel sheet. Instead, you can just jump straight into, for this site with these individuals in question, who is the best placed person to solve that? Of course, deeming it, if whether or not it's deemed significant. Now, in that case, I think it absolutely was deemed significant, but often, as Alexis pointed out, usually the burden and thresholds are significantly lower for small sites.
Great, thank you. And kind of related to that, so Sarah Jones Morris has said, should the habitat management and monitoring plans include all habitats, existing, proposed and enhance, as some LPAs are now requesting, even though national guidance typically requires them only for habitats of significance that are created or enhanced?
We use the small site metric HMMP template, which is actually does include all of them, but in a proportionate way. So there's not a huge amount of additional information you need to provide for that. In our experience, that has worked really well. But what we've also done is we take the feedback from different LPAs about what they want to see, and where possible, we try and make it a standardized thing, but also we're happy to make it LPA specific. So I think that, you know, for example, I saw Rosie actually appeared on thing, and hopefully not revealing any you know, things that, you know, Brent's one of the councils that we've engaged with and have sent feedback on. You know, we try and make sure that we're constantly improving the service so that the HMP, you know, in an automated way, that the applicant goes through, and actually, you know, because it's all digital, we can suck up that information and go, this is what this council would like to see. But you don't need to worry about, you know, scratching your head and going, oh, how do I find this? It's all pulled together from what you've already entered. Here it goes. National requirements ticked, local requirements ticked as well.
Brilliant, thank you. And I do know that Natural England are shortly, if not already, undertaking consultation on improvements to their templates for HMMP. So there should be an opportunity for people to get involved and share feedback on use of those templates. So in terms of the digital tools and the allocation of units, if using BNGX, who is responsible for allocating units on the register?
So in terms of how it works on BNGX, now I'm careful not to speak on their behalf because obviously that's a separate company, and I want to like do all the obviously disclaimers there. But basically, it's all based on pro forma legal documentation, which makes clear that when the buyer purchases those units, that, you know, guide packs are provided so that they can inform Natural England and the register as well. But also BNGX as a conduit to facilitate, you know, and make sure that if any questions on the register or the like, that can be solved straight away.
And I'm
Or
just jumping in only because I had a demo a couple of years ago on this, and I'm coming back to it's coming back to me, but it does automatically produce the allocation form and stuff, which I remember being like, oh my God, that's so cool. But that was years ago, so it might be different now.
No, it's the same. But yeah, so no, absolutely.
Okay, thank you, Alexa, as well. And so a question from me, on topic, but slightly off piste. How do you think the current rapid evolution of AI tools is going to affect the products and services that you provide and other people who are in this kind of market?
So I'll caveat here, we're talking about how we've approached it, but also talk about, you know, in a sector as a whole. Now, to our mind, we came in with the role of, with the philosophy of we want to support ecologists and others to discharge it. To my mind, a machine cannot replace an ecologist. It cannot replace that eyes on the ground approach. So we have not actually embraced AI in that way. There is some digital things we can do in terms of helping us like scan local authorities and have a clever AI on the web internet telling us, oh, there's a new requirement and stuff, and so that we can jump in and engage with LPA officers and go, oh, we've just seen that this has been updated. How can we accommodate that? But no, I mean, to my mind, that's where AI, it does not belong on the field. That is the purview of the ecologist / the competent person. And our tools are to facilitate that. Now, there are AI tools and I think AI Dash as well, who've taken a slightly different approach. The one thing I'd say is that at the moment, legislation makes clear it has to be based on the role of a competent person, a responsible person. So, and so long as that's the case, humans will always have a key role. But so to my mind, AI has a role to play. To my mind, it's an ultra supportive role in the background, stay back there. But that's the that's the approach I think that we should take.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, and thanks again for making it solutions focused as well. I will hand back over to Ellie now to introduce our next speaker.
Yeah, thanks, and also thanks, Oliver. I just think today we've had such excellent presentations and excellent Q&As, and I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion. So we've got our final speaker now, who's Jason Reeves, policy lead at CIEEM. Jason leads CIEEM's influencing and advocacy activities, being responsible for ensuring that CIEEM is recognised by its members and external stakeholders as the voice of the profession across the UK and Ireland. He has nearly 20 years' experience in the environmental sector, is a trustee of Wildlife and Countryside Link, and volunteers with practical wildlife conservation groups in his local area. So Jason will be our final speaker, and then we'll have a short break and then go for our panel discussion. So over to you, Jason.
Thank you very much, Ellie. Yes, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. It's really interesting listening to all the other three speakers go ahead of this one, because this one's kind of looking backwards into the past as to what we thought some time ago. And I did wonder when we were putting this all together, maybe this one should have gone first as sort of setting the history and then we look forward, but actually it's been really interesting because some of the things I'm going to talk about in here have definitely moved on. So I can kind of relate back to some of the things other people have said already, so it would be quite useful in that sense. So yeah, so I'm going to talk about this report, BNG for Small Sites, that we put out in January. Just a quick bit of background on CIEEM. So we've been involved with BNG for quite some time. We were one of the 3 organisations that published the principles back in 2016, and then the original guidance that came out in 2019. So we've been involved for a long time at various levels, me on sort of the policy side of things, Mark and his team on the sort of practice side of teams. And I have to actually say that it's Mark's team that did all the work behind this. I'm just here presenting it in a way. So his team has to take the credit for that. One of the things in going through all of this information we need to keep in mind is that this was published in January, so that's now 8 months ago, into mandatory BNG for small sites. And that would have been what, 11 months for standard metric and standard mandatory biodiversity net gain. And that it was based on some survey work even before that. So we're going back to November 2024 when we actually collected that information from respondents. So bear in mind, but I'll talk through some of the answers that have been given, but bear in mind that this work now is 7 months in the past, as it were. So the report summarises the evidence of issues with small sites, which we've heard a lot of already, and primarily from ecologists who have already had experience with small sites, and I'll talk about that a little bit more as well as we go through it. And then the report collated a number of modifications, solutions, you might say, that could potentially address those issues that were identified, but we've heard a lot already from some of the speakers, so I can relate back to what's been said already. So respondents to the survey. So most were from the private sector. That's consultant ecologists working for a developer in some or other sense. But crucially, we also had a really nice chunk of local authority ecologists as well also responded. So we got both sides of that picture, which I will come back to as well when we start to talk about some of the issues. There's some slight differences there, but really useful to see that we're mostly on the same page. and that most of those respondents, or over half of them, had been involved in more than 10 small sites BNG projects, and almost 2/3, sorry, 3/4, 6 or more. So most of them had been involved, had had that experience, and as we'll see from this slide, I think it was really obvious that it wasn't working at the time. So 84% of respondents saying that there were major problems with small sites BNG. Excuse me. So if we take a look at the overall response from all of those respondents with the potential issues, we see with those major issues, if you look at the green lines, there's a whole range of issues, and most of them, in fact, there's only a few where the green line isn't taller than all the other bars. So definitely a range of issues, which, as we've already heard, causes a multitude of headaches. So if we just go through this one, so this is the overall responses from everyone: too much work for ecologists, too much cost for developers, too much work for planning authorities. So coming back to that capacity issue between both the ecologist, the consultant ecologist, and the local authorities. Inaccurate baseline assessments, come back to that competent person, whether that's an ecologist or not. Inaccurate use of the metric, sort of a middling one there, but then perverse outcomes of the metric, definitely an issue. Difficulties with delivering on site, we've heard lots of that already around small sites. Peter made a really good illustration of that with some very small sites and the issues there. The high cost of offset units, but as we've also heard, that's coming down now. The difficulty with obtaining fractional units was a big issue then as well. That's also coming down. And then a sort of a mixed response to the cumulative impacts, but also probably isn't taken into account in the same way as standard mandatory biodiversity net gain. And then if we look at consultants, is that consultants? Sorry, I've got the bar in the way here. Yeah, consultants. So too much work for ecologists, repeated again, too much cost for developers, issues with capacity in the local planning authorities. And then we go to things like the inaccurate baseline assessments. So again, if it's not an ecologist involved, is someone else having to fix that? Potentially is that the local authority having a problem with that? Again, perverse outcomes from the use of the metric. Massive, again, difficulties with on-site delivery. That's the big one for everyone. And then again, those repeated lack of small units for offsite, high cost of offset units offsite, and difficulties in obtaining fractional units. And then with local authorities, it's slightly different, but with a big overlap. So you've still got too much work for the ecologists. They aren't obviously as concerned about the costs for the developers, but that's not necessarily their problem, is it? Too much work for the planning authority, that one spikes a bit. Inaccurate baseline assessment by others spikes a bit more, because obviously that's an issue for them. There's more work coming in if there's inaccurate or poorly completed applications coming in. That creates more work for them, which relates, I think, to inaccurate use of the metric. Again, difficulties with on-site delivery and lack of units for off-site. High cost of off-site units and the difficulty of obtaining fractional units. So there's a big overlap in there, and some of those issues we've obviously already heard about some of the issues and some of the solutions actually for that. So that's actually really useful. So I'm going to go into some of the solutions that were suggested. Please bear in mind that as we go through these are things that were suggested we're going back 6-7 months already now, and things have definitely moved on. What we did find is that there were definite overlaps in the solutions that were suggested from those respondents, and that there were common solutions across the local authorities and the consultants. One of the most popular ones, was that we just changed the de minimis threshold and we exclude developments involving just 1 or 2 housing units. But I will say that may well have been a reaction back then when everything was a real headache. And I definitely agree with the suggestions from Oliver and Alexa that actually every time we lose an opportunity like this, that's a lost opportunity for nature. And we're probably looking at that being an addition to nature loss and a lost opportunity for nature recovery. So we may not well agree with that now, but this is what was proposed at the end of last year. Amending the small sites metric to take better account of very small sites, in particular private gardens. We've already heard about that from Peter and from Oliver. Definitely an adjustment there would help things. Avoiding the overvaluation of habitats such as closely mown lawns to allow more flexibility. So would we allow things, say, because they have been excluded, like bat boxes, bird boxes, artificial habitats, or tree planting, to make up that gain? And I think there's a lot to be said for that, in that if you have a closely mown lawn that's probably got fertilizer and herbicide added to it as well, yes, there's a small biodiversity value to it, but would you actually be gaining more from something else? And maybe there is a conversation to be had around not just an actual habitat, but those artificial additional habitat or enhancements, as you might call them. Low distinctiveness areas should be excluded from the condition assessment requirements. That would reduce the workload there. Again, if you take that closely mown lawn as an example, how much different really could there be in condition assessment for that? And as has been mentioned before, this clarification of what's meant by a competent person in relation to the small sites metric. I mean, ideally, we'd love for all of this to be undertaken by a qualified ecologist, but we have to set this in the context of there also being a capacity issue for the sector, not necessarily having all the right skills in the right places in the sector as well. But there's definitely something that can be done in terms of updating this. And Oliver mentioned this as well around, can we better define this so that it's someone with some kind of ecological understanding that would save time and money for the developer, you know, who we've mentioned already might be very small and commercially constrained, but would also help the local authority ecologists with have someone who's a bit more understanding of what it is they're filling in and the processes. If we weren't to amend the small sites metric, should we promote the use of the standard metric more? We've already discussed this. Peter mentioned around actually more ecologists are using this anyway, and it might actually fit better that if you're going to do that, you're doing most of that baseline survey stuff anyway for a PEA to get your baselines. Why not just do that? So there's an obvious route we could explore there. Habitat management and monitoring plans, are they overly burdensome for very small sites? There was a suggestion that we could have an appropriately worded preoccupation condition so that whoever takes occupancy of the property would be required to undertake an audit by a competent person, well, you know, a defined competent person again. And could they then, in some or other way, audit the site or have someone else audit the site, preferably with photographic evidence, and that be submitted to the local authority and they can say, yep, okay, we can sign off the conditions being met. Another suggestion. Introduction of a tariff or a fixed payment system. So bear in mind, this was suggested 7 months ago. I do take that there are issues with this, both as Oliver and Alexa have pointed out. This is definitely muddied now in some ways by the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, and that we have a government whose rhetoric has changed over time, and the possibility for all sorts of things to be swept up into one fund that then potentially doesn't get spent. That means you have a delay in the spend. It might be spent somewhere else on something else. There are definite issues with it. I mean, I don't necessarily know that we should take it off the table, but there are definitely concerns with that, and more so now with the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. Is there an opportunity for more local habitat banks, potentially operated by local authorities, but not necessarily? That would make off-site units locally more accessible and affordable. Government would probably have to play a role in facilitating this and enabling it more as well, though. And then more training. We've talked about this a little bit. More training for local authorities in all respects of small sites, including those exemptions. More training for developers, planning and architects. I think there's definitely still an issue with very small developers not understanding their obligations around small sites BNG. So some training, probably some awareness raising, sorry, is still necessary for this as we continue to embed it and as it evolves. And then the last one around the introduction of more user-friendly tools. If we're going to go down the competent person, so for non-ecologists, perhaps we can get more ecologists involved to complete the small sites metric. I would add into that one that we probably also want to talk about better guidance. We've obviously got some coming through, as Mark has mentioned and others have mentioned, from Natural England and from PAS, Planning Advisory Service. But more of that and more clarity on that would certainly be helpful. So just to wrap all of that up, there's definitely a willingness to make BNG for small sites work. The whole thing through the survey came back that people want this to work. They want it to work for nature restoration. Certainly that nature recovery element is what we want from the process. We have to accept, and obviously the snapshot was back in 6 months ago, that there will be teething issues. We saw that with mandatory biodiversity net gain, standard net gain. We've seen it more so, obviously, with small sites, but that there will always be teething issues, and that we just need to be committed to what it is we want to achieve and work through those. And also that it's a really fast area. We've seen just in the 6 months from when this was taken how much things have changed, that things continue to evolve and change and move on. And what we really need is just ongoing dialogue, but some changes as well. But ongoing dialogue with all relevant stakeholders would be really helpful and useful. So that is a whip round of the survey. Hopefully that was useful and can add to the panel discussion as well. And if anyone has any questions, thank you.
Thank you, Jason. So please do put questions in the Q&A box if anyone has any. One thing that's come out from the Q&A box, so it's an anonymous question and it will inform the panel discussion as well, I think. But pointing out there's much discussion about a levy as an alternative for small sites, but is the purchase of off-site units not in itself a levy because its measures as to what needs offsetting and it's going towards nature recovery should be proportionate for the scale of the loss. So how would a different levy be an improvement over off-site or offsetting?
Well, they're different, aren't they? Because so in theory, the off-site, you would be purchasing it. So the developer or the consultant ecologist would be overseeing that. Whereas if you go into a levy, you're just putting money in a pot and it disappears somewhere.
Thank you.
Alexa wants to come in as well.
Yeah, I'm a bit overexcited about that. Yeah, exactly. What I think it makes biodiversity net gain more acceptable as a version of a levy, if you like, is that a developer is always free to measure the potential harm, minimize the potential harm, and only buy biodiversity units or a fraction of a unit after they've done what they can to avoid the harms in the first place. So my view is that's very different to, you know, money going into an LPA that they may not have the infrastructure to spend it yet, or access to the land to deliver the local nature recovery strategy, or into a central pot where you've got no idea whether what you're paying is going to fund the interventions that are needed for as long as they're needed to be funded. So I think by making sure that you don't divorce the developers' choices and impacts on nature from the money they're going to be forced to pay, it ensures that they're encouraged to minimize harm first. The moment it becomes a roof tax, like, oh, you're building free homes, you've got to pay this much money. If it wouldn't encourage them to avoid harm first, which we all know is what then accelerates the decline of nature. And we don't even know what is being harmed. And we have no idea whether what's being delivered is bringing any kind of gain at all. So that's why having a metric that measures the losses and the same metric that measures the gains means that you keep those things in tandem, in lockstep, so you're genuinely got the best possible chances of delivering actual gains for nature, not arbitrary cash going into a pot that might never be spent.
Thank you, Alexa. Peter, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, no one disagrees with that principle. The issue with small sites is that most small sites, the impact is negligible, and that's the issue. We keep talking about this issue about small sites as like, well, if you add all these small sites together, they have a huge impact on nature. The impact on most small sites, the impact is negligible. And let's not conflate nature recovery and BNG. By far the biggest way of achieving nature recovery is reform agricultural policy. By far. And we're pinning everything on BNG. BNG in small sites, most small sites I deal with, the impact is negligible. So the issue is not that small sites shouldn't offset their impact. Yes, they should, but the current process is creating a huge amount of bureaucracy and cost to achieve negligible outcomes. So I'm buying 0.05 units. And even though the cost of units is coming down, it's still a disproportionate cost for small site developers because you're paying admin costs as part of that as well. That doesn't change. So it's just this disproportionate cost of trying to address the BNG process through small sites. No one suggesting. I get slightly annoyed when people like myself and many other consultant ecologists who deal with this day in, day out are almost accused of like, oh, we're just like, don't worry about small sites. We're not saying that. We just want an efficient, quick, easy way of dealing with small sites that doesn't involve someone like myself going to someone's garden, doing a BNG assessment, writing a BNG assessment report, that to be assessed by a local authority. The local authority say, plant a tree or pay 0.05 units, then having to write a biodiversity game plan to get that signed off. That transactional cost of doing all that process for negligible things. That's the issue. And a simple payment, and that payment could go straight to the nearest habitat bank. It's not about the payment going to the local authority. There's this conflation, this idea is that all it will do is go up into a local authority and they'll just piss it away or won't spend it. It could go to a habitat bank.
Okay.
Yeah, and
Thank
I
you,
think
Peter.
I agree with you there, because I think we've got two ways of doing it. We either rip up what we've got and try and recreate a levy system and make sure we don't kind of accidentally encourage turning ancient woodland into a levy, which is what government seems to want to do now. Or we go with what we're doing and let it reach that level of simplicity of transaction. Crucially, everybody's saying it has negligible impact, but what we have no measurement. If exemptions are being abused or overused, we're losing critical data of what is even being lost. So I think that there's no harm in knowing what's there, mitigating your impacts, and then buying fractional units on the press of a button if you need them, and all within the confines of what we've got. And it's much better than it going into a data black hole where, as you say, there are sites with protected species likely to be on there, sites with priority habitats likely to be on there. If we're then also saying the impacts are negligible, we're sort of missing a trick. I think we should just know what's there. It will get easier over time. We've definitely had implementation problems that were avoidable, but I think that we're much better off, as all of these recommendations have been, refining, improving, building the confidence of LPAs. Some on-site games will just never even need to be legally secured at all if the LPAs are made more confident. So yeah, I just think it's better for us to know what we're losing before we lose it.
And no one's suggesting we shouldn't be doing that. I mean, there are many people like myself who are doing these things day in, day out, going to sites and saying, why am I doing this on... Please, everyone, go and measure 5 by 5 meters, 25 square meters. Go and measure it. It's the size of a small bathroom, and we're doing BNG assessments on 30 square meters of suburban lawn. It's madness.
Okay. Thank you, Peter. I'm going to bring Oliver in here.
No, very quickly, just on Peter's point. I mean, one of the interesting things we've seen in the last few months is actually, because I completely see where Peter's coming from in terms of don't want to do particular sites. It doesn't seem to be, in the right sort of space, as it were. But what we've seen in the last few weeks is actually a emergence of, especially people using digital tools, sort of actually keen to focus on these areas. And as I say, costs coming down because the volume allows the, the infrastructural costs to come down. So I think actually what I would say is, if people don't want to do, for a very understandable reason, small site surveys, there are more and more people emerging who do want to do them and can be passed over to them, as it were, who can do it, and with the digital tools can bring those costs down and ever more down as well. So I think the market is responding.
Thank you, Oliver. There's a question in the chat box about whether we have any plans to repeat the survey, Jason, and I think that's something for me and you to discuss about at what point that would give us useful information on the basis of any changes or tweaks that may have been made in the interim. I don't know if you have any other thoughts.
I think it would be useful. I think we have moved on. It's when we've got the capacity to do it, I suppose. Yes, but yeah, one for us to discuss and pick up.
Yeah, thank you. And another anonymous question: should the mitigation hierarchy differ between small and major developments, i.e., the bar being set higher on small sites? Jason, I'll give you first dibs, but Alexa has got her hand up on
No,
that.
you go.
I'll let Alexa take it.
Well, no, I actually think that the mitigation hierarchy can and should be flexible enough to respond to the real site as it stands, rather than being too prescriptive. Like for a small sites like this, then for a larger sites like this, and then for even larger sites like that. For rural sites, it's like this. I just think the key principle are avoid what you can and work with your planning authority to make the good set out clearly your decisions as to why it's sensible to go off-site. And I think that it's about being rational and sensible and not adding more rules and sort of frameworks to it. It should be flexible and site, specific and rational and proportionate, in my view.
Thanks, Alexa. There's one more question in the chat box, which is there a potential role for looking at the Warwickshire BNG model for small sites?
That's a good question. So I know, yeah, Warwickshire were right off the bat, weren't they? They were really pioneering in all of this and created their own metrics and things. Is there something they're doing specifically now? Is there that is unique?
I can come in on this if yeah, so they were one of the councils who were able to do the pilot for BNG, and I think they're kind of held up as a real case study of best practice, because interestingly this does come into kind of this concept of doing a levy or small sites. They were able to, in the pilot, from what I understand, to pool the funds from BNG, and they didn't have to kind of follow the mitigation hierarchy so strictly in that way. And I know you and also Oliver have shown a few examples of when that kind of approach hasn't worked well, with kind of these pots of money not being spent and stuff. But I think Warwickshire is held up as a real example of they were able to do some really great things with that. But that's
Yeah.
all I know. And we
And
do
like
have David Lowe,
Oxfordshire.
sorry, just to say, we have David Lowe from Warwickshire County Council speaking at our event on Thursday, kind of about this as well. So yeah.
Yeah, because I think some of the pioneering local planning authorities, like Warwickshire is one of them, and really celebrated, because the good thing with this law is we've had years of pilots to see what does it mean if units are undervalued, how many LPAs have actually spent the money, what did it get spent on, and Trust for Oxfordshire in Oxfordshire as well is a brilliant example, and Greater Manchester Combined Authorities working with charities. There's been some great pioneering work here, and what this does is under this BNG regime, it doesn't get rid of the ability to do that. It just gives a framework to say, at least try and avoid the harms first, and make sure that your habitat banks are legally secured first, so that the money isn't all collected into a pot and maybe isn't spent because maybe not quite enough is gathered. So it's actually only building on what these pioneering planning authorities have done and added a bit more legal rigour to say, make sure your habitat bank is legally secured first, to avoid all of those big pot of cash problems that we know are there in the billions already.
Thank you, Alexa. Ellie, I think there are no more questions in the Q&A box, or there's some things that we may pick up in the panel discussion. So if it's okay with you, I suggest we have slightly longer than 5 minutes for a comfort break and a cup of tea. So I'd just like to really thank the 4 speakers that we've had so far.